Okay, in this screencast, we're going to talk about, we're going to perform a literary analysis on The Story of an Hour by Kate Chapon. And in our previous screencast, we talked about the process of literary analysis and how to become an active reader and a lot of things that you really want to start looking for as you read to help you with your analysis. Remember that we're wanting to think carefully about the moves that the writer makes. Even the seemingly small details can be very critical to the story. Remember to pay attention to your title, to pay attention to your beginnings and your endings, not just the story itself, but of the paragraphs. Pay attention to the author's tone and the mood that the reader sets. Look for any shifts in setting, tone, speaker. Look for point of view. Who's telling the story, and how can that? What message does that send? How is that critical? Look for the author's use of language, and for things that cause you to pay attention, any details that trigger like memories or strong emotions, figurative language that you make a connection with, and always think about it in terms of other texts that you've read too, to help you point some things out. So, well, we've already read it once together, so now we're just going to kind of go back through and we're going to talk about a couple of elements to help our understanding of the story. So, let's start with the title itself. And you can see over here on the right-hand side where I kind of did some annotating. And that's a really good habit for you to get into. Annotating as you read is an awesome tool for you to have. It also helps you later when you go back and you've made all these little notes in the margins. It's really good for refreshing your memory as well. So the title indicates that the story is going to be brief, right? It's an hour. It's a short period of time. So that can mean like physical length, or also in the decisive nature of what happens in a very short period of time. We know that the story is going to be short because it takes place in an hour, but this story ultimately begins and ends, has a very decisive nature within a very short period of time. Okay? Knowing that Mrs. Mallard was afflicted with a heart trouble, great care was taken to break to her as gently as possible the news of her husband's death. Right off the bat, we have the fact that she had something wrong with her. She has some kind of heart condition. We also note there that she is addressed as Mrs. Mallard, and we'll come back to that in just a moment. It was her sister Josephine who told her in broken sentences. Before I move any further from there, there's the juxtaposition of the fact that we have Mrs. Mallard, who is not introduced by first name, but immediately following, we have her sister, who is identified by her first name. In broken sentences, veiled hints that revealed and half concealing, her husband's friend Richards was there too, near her. It was he who had been in the newspaper office when intelligence of the railroad disaster was received, with Brentley Mallard's name leading the list of killed. He had only taken the time to assure himself of its truth by a second telegram, and had hastened to forestall any less careful, less tender friend in bearing the sad message. So, Mrs. Mallard's husband has been killed in a railroad disaster. Her husband's friend has hastened to her house to tell her the news before someone else who might not be as tender or gentle can do it. She did not hear the story as most women have heard the same, with a paralyzed inability to accept its significance. She wept at once with sudden, wild abandonment in her sister's arms. She's grieving. She wept at once, sudden, wild abandonment. She grieves in an overwhelming manner. When the storm of grief had spent itself, she went away to her room alone. She would have no one follow her. There stood, facing the open window, a comfortable, roomy armchair. Into this she sank, pressed down by a physical exhaustion that haunted her body and seemed to reach into her soul. So she weeps with this overwhelming grief, And then she shuts herself up in her room alone, and sinks in a physical exhaustion down into a chair in front of an open window. She could see in the open square before her house the tops of trees that were all aquiver with the new spring life. The delicious breath of rain was in the air. In the street below, a peddler was crying his wares. The notes of a distant song which someone was singing reached her faintly, and countless sparrows were twittering in the eaves. There were patches of blue sky showing here and there through the clouds that had met and piled one above the other in the west facing her window. So what we have this three paragraphs of this delicious outside world that is happening just right outside her open window. And it seems to be kind of inviting her to join, to leave the oppression of her room and that chair that she's exhausted her body into, to come and join her in this open window. So you have this open, which that word is repeated twice. And you have this open window with this world outside. And inside, you have this oppression, this physical exhaustion. Everything inside seems very oppressive. She sat with her head thrown back upon the cushion of the chair, quite motionless, except when a sob came into her throat and shook her, as a child who has cried itself to sleep continues to sob in its dreams. She was young, with a fair, calm face, whose lines bespoke repression and even a certain strength. But now there was a dull stare in her eyes, whose gaze was fixed away off yonder on one of those patches of blue sky. It was not a glance of reflection, but rather indicated a suspension of intelligent thought. There was something coming to her, and she was waiting for it, fearfully. What was it? She did not know. It was too subtle and elusive to name. But she felt it, creeping out of the sky, reaching toward her through the sounds, the scents, the color that filled the air. Now her bosom rose and fell tumultuously. She was beginning to recognize this thing that was approaching to possess her, and she was striving to beat it back with her will, as powerless as her two white, slender hands would have been. When she abandoned herself, a little whispered word escaped her slightly parted lips. She said it over and over under her breath. Free, free, free. The vacant stare and the look of terror that had followed it went from her eyes. They stayed keen and bright. Her pulses beat fast, and the coursing blood warmed and relaxed every inch of her body. What's happening here? She's sitting here. She's in the oppression of her room. She's looking out the window at this outside, delicious outside world that she sees. And there's something coming to her, some thought, something that she is thinking, that she's trying to fight here. This is a shift. You have to pay attention to these shifts. Okay? So we have this shift from this sorrow, this oppressive weight, physical exhaustion, she describes it, that she has, and now there's something happening to her. She is having a physical struggle. This thought is coming, it's creeping out of the sky, and her body reacts to what's happening. Her bosom is rising and falling tumultuously. She's trying to beat it back with her will. Very physical, passionate terms. Okay? So then she abandons herself to it, right? She lets go of the struggle, and she realizes that she is going to be free, and everything relaxes in her body. Her blood warms her up, her eyes become bright, and her body is relaxed. She is free. Okay, so we'll talk about like the implications of that in just a little bit. We'll come back to that. She did not stop to ask if it were not a monstrous joy that held her. A clear and exalted perception enabled her to dismiss the suggestion as trivial. She knew that she would weep again when she saw the kind, tender hands folded in death, the face that had never looked save with love upon her, fixed and gray and dead. But she saw beyond that bitter moment a long procession of years to come that would belong to her, absolutely. And she opened and spread her arms out to them in welcome. There would be no one to live for during those coming years. She would live for herself. There would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. A kind intention or a cruel intention made the act seem no less a crime as she looked upon it in that brief moment of illumination. And yet she had loved him, sometimes. Often she had not. What did it matter? What could love, the unresolved mystery, count for in the face of this possession of self-assertion which she suddenly recognized as the strongest impulse of her being? Free, body and soul free, she kept whispering. Josephine was kneeling before the closed door with her lips to the keyhole, imploring for admission. Louise, open the door. I beg, open the door. You will make yourself ill. What are you doing, Louise? For heaven's sake, open the door. This is the very, very first time that she is identified as herself. And it happens after she is undergone that change, right? From married Mrs. Mallard to free Louise. Go away. I'm not making myself ill. No, she was drinking in a very elixir of life through that open window. There it is again, the open window. Her fancy was running riot along those days ahead of her, spring days and summer days and all sorts of days that would be her own. She breathed a quick prayer that life might be long. It was only yesterday she had thought with a shudder that life might be long. She arose at length and opened the door to her sister's importunities. There was a feverish triumph in her eyes, and she carried herself unwittingly like a goddess of victory. She clasped her sister's waist, and together they descended the stairs. Richard stood waiting for them at the bottom. Someone was opening the front door with a latch key. It was Brentley Mallard who entered, a little travel-stained, composedly carrying his gripsack and umbrella. He had been far from the scene of the accident, and did not even know that there had been one. He stood amazed at Josephine's piercing cry, at Richard's quick motion to screen him from the view of his wife. But Richard's was too late. When the doctors came, they said she had died of heart disease, of joy that kills. So, ironically, her husband had not perished in an accident, and just when she'd resolved herself to begin her life anew, free, she dies of a cardiac arrest, a heart issue, likely drops dead of a heart attack from seeing him walk through the door. Now let's talk about the implications of this. First of all, this is a third-person omniscient narrator who is telling us this story. He's kind of like all-seeing and all-knowing. He can see inside the heads, the thoughts of the characters, but he is not physically, or she is not physically a character in the story, him or herself. And the impact of that is that from the very beginning, we know something about Miss Mallard that's critical to the story that we may not have known if the story was told from a different viewpoint. And the story ends after she's already dead. So the story really begins and is told through a cycle where we would not have known what happened to her if it was told from Miss Mallard's point of view. I'm going to stop this film because it's fixing to stop in time, and then I'll pick up with part 2 in just 1 second.